Welcome, traveler, to Boring History for Sleepa, quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Tonight's journey will carry us through the cobbled streets of ancient Rome, not to marvel at its triumphs, but to uncover its darker rituals. For Rome, the heart of a mighty empire, was not just a place of law and order, it was a place of spectacle, of fear, of punishments, so strange and symbolic, they seem almost unreal today. Some were cruel, others were oddly theatrical, many so bizarre they will linger in your thoughts long after the candles go out. So settle in, let your breathing slow. The night is long, and the story winds deep, and together, we'll step into a world where justice wore a very different face. Let us begin. Take a step back, not just through years, but through centuries. Let the light of the present dim like a candle at dusk. Breathe slowly. The air thickens with time, scented faintly of olive oil, dust, and old parchment. Before us rises the eternal city, Rome. Not the Rome of today, bustling with tourists and echoes of faded grandeur. The ancient Rome, alive and thriving, its beating heart as fierce as its discipline. The year might be 63 BCE, or perhaps to 12 CE. It doesn't matter. The Roman world was eternal lore, so it thought. And it didn't change quickly. For hundreds of years, one thing held it together: control. Tonight, we wander not through the triumphs of the empire, but through its shadows. Through a city obsessed with law, obsessed with order, and prepared to enforce it with punishments that would make even hardened modern minds flinch. But first, let's arrive properly. Arriving in Rome, imagine yourself now walking through one of Rome's great gates. Gates the Porta, Capena, perhaps dust clinging to your sandals. The sun a low disk in the sky behind you. Before you, the city spreads like a great machine of stone and fire, rising and falling with the movement of its people. You pass by grocers selling fish cured in salt, amphorae of wine cooling in shady corners, children running barefoot along the cobblestones. Senator in flowing white robes walks by, nose high in the air, trailed by clients eager to curry favor. The clang of bronze armor rings from a nearby guard post. But beneath this seemingly civil order lies something else, something colder. Rome is not just a place of learning and luxury. It is a city built on fear, and fear is enforced. A city governed by land punishment. To live in Rome was to live by its laws. And there were laws for everything. The 12 tables, carved in bronze in the early Republic, were the beginning laws concerning theft, debt, marriage, burial, and treason. But over time, the Roman legal system grew into a vast, complex tapestry of rules and restrictions. Some were logical, some were archaic, some were downright strange. But one thing united them all: they came with consequences. And Roman justice was not shy, did not whisper behind closed doors or act gently out of view. No, Roman justice was a performance. It was a message meant not just for the criminal, but for the entire crowd watching. You see, in the Roman mind, punishment had a dual purpose. One, to avenge the wrong, restoring the balance of law. Two, to terrify the rest, ensuring no one ever dared break that law again, just as a spectacle. Let us pause here, traveler, to understand this deeply. To our modern minds, punishment is often hidden, administered quietly in a courtroom, behind steel doors, in sterile cells. But to the Romans, punishment was theater, a public flogging in the forum, an execution in the arena, a sentence delivered aloud to gasps and murmurs. The Romans didn't just believe in order, they believed in the power of example. If one slave tried to flee, punish him where the others can see. If a senator betrayed the state, let his downfall echo through every marble column of the Curia. If a soldier ran from battle, let the legion draw lots and kill every 10th man. Fear kept people in line. Fear was efficient, and it worked. For centuries, it worked. But it also created a society where law and cruelty walked side by side, like twin wolves guarding the city gates. The layers of Roman society and their justice, of course. Not everyone in Rome faced justice the same way. Much depended on who you were. Citizen had rights. He could not be crucified, for example. He could appeal to Caesar himself in later years. A slave had no such protections. His life was property. A woman was subject to the will of her father or husband, her freedom restricted by expectations and double standards, and an enemy of the state. Their punishment knew no bounds. Rome was a society of classes, and justice followed those lines like roads through the empire. What was a fine for one man might be death for another. Even among the elite, when one fell from favor, mercy rarely followed. As emperors grew increasingly paranoid and cruel, senators who once walked proudly in togas found themselves forced to drink poison or fall on their swords. It was said that in the time of Nero, silence became the only safe opinion. A city that punished creatively, you might ask. Why were their punishments so strange? Why throw someone into a river sewn into a sack with a monkey and a snake? Why bury a priestess alive rather than simply executing her? Why burn someone dressed as Hercules in a mock theater play? The answer lies in symbolism. The Romans believed in meaningful suffering. Punishment was often designed not just to kill but to represent something. A man who killed his father was seen as disrupting the natural order, so he would die in a sack surrounded by creatures representing chaos. A Vestal virgin who broke her vow polluted the sacred fire of Rome. Her punishment had to preserve her. Symbolic purity, as it killed her. A thief might be crucified near the road he robbed, his rotting body a warning to every passerby. But it wasn't enough that justice be done. It had to be seen, and it had to make people think twice. Superstition and law. A curious blend, let us not forget, traveler, that the Romans were deeply superstitious. Religion and law were woven together. Omens, portents, and rituals surrounded the administration of justice. A trial might be postponed if thunder rumbled during the proceedings. A magistrate might consult augurs to ensure the gods approved of the verdict. And punishments, too, carried religious weight. Sacrilege, adultery, and violating sacred spaces were considered not just crimes against man, but crimes against the gods. The punishments, therefore, had to appease divine wrath, often in highly symbolic ways. This fusion of law, ritual, and cruelty created a system that was both deeply logical and terrifyingly poetic. The role of the crowd. Complicit spectators. As you walk deeper into the city, toward the Colosseum, the crowd grows thicker. These are the citizens of Rome and women who gather not just to buy grain or hear orators, but to watch punishment unfold. And this, perhaps, is the most chilling part of all. The Roman people were not passive observers of justice. They were its audience and sometimes its chorus. When criminals were fed to wild beasts or paraded through the streets in chains, it was the crowd that cheered or jeered. Punishment not witnessed was a punishment wasted. And so, like a strange ritual play, justice became entertainment. Rome was not just a republic or an empire. It was a stage, and the punishments, carefully choreographed acts of state-sponsored theater, preparing to journey deeper now. As twilight settles over the rooftops, the lamps are being lit with oil. The forum grows quiet, the market stalls roll closed, and the great temples stand silent under a darkening sky. You, traveler, are now ready. Ready to walk the shadowed halls of Roman punishment. Ready to see what justice meant in an age of emperors and gods. Ready to uncover the most bizarre, symbolic, and surreal acts of discipline ever recorded in human history. Tonight, we will explore not just what happened to those who broke the rules, but why the rules themselves were so harsh. And as you drift further into the calm of night, remember, history is not always noble. Sometimes it's brutal, but always, it is human. So breathe deep. Let your eyes grow heavy. The story continues, not with emperors and generals, but with the condemned, the punished, and the forgotten. The strangest punishments of ancient Rome await. The fire has not gone out. You are still with us, still gliding through the twilight of ancient Rome's curious and often cruel history. And now, we arrive at one of its most haunting practices, a punishment not only rare, but deeply symbolic. It is the tale of women chosen to live above ordinary law, and what happened when they broke their sacred vow. Tonight, we descend into the quiet world of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most revered priestesses, and the lonely bearers of one of the empire's strangest, most suffocating punishments, The sacred fire of Rome, in the very heart of the Roman Forum, behind elegant columns and marble walls, stood the Temple of Vesta. It was unlike the grand temples of Jupiter or Mars, modest. Round and always flickering with light, it housed the sacred fire of Rome, said to represent the eternal life of the city itself. And who tended this sacred flame? Not men, not warriors, but 6 women, the Vestal Virgins. Chosen as children often between the tender ages of 6 and 10, these girls were taken from noble families and given over to the state. For the next 30 years, they would live cloistered in the House of the Vestals, a secluded palace near the temple. Their job was clear, though immense: tend the fire, maintain purity, represent the moral heart of the empire. They lived lives of silence, devotion, and privilege. They were honored guests at public events, immune to some male authority, and carried with them an aura of divine protection. But with that honor came a price, as if a Vestal ever broke her vow of celibacy, the result was not merely scandal, it was death, the law above all laws. To the Romans, the Vestals were not just priestesses, they were the spiritual linchpins of society. If one of them faltered, it was believed the very foundations of Rome might crack. Failed harvest, a plague, a military loss, the gods must be angry. And often, suspicion fell on the Vestals. A sign from heaven could trigger investigations, rumors, and worse. They were expected to remain celibate for the entire duration of their service, 30 years. After that, they were allowed to marry. Some did. Others, perhaps too molded by solitude and ritual, remained alone. But if a Vestal broke her vow before her service was complete, she committed what was known as incestum, a crime not just of the flesh, but of sacrilege. It wasn't merely adultery, it was a direct offense against the goddess Vesta, and by extension, the health of Rome itself. The punishment. Buried alive now? You might think the Romans, ever creative in their cruelties, would devise some gruesome theatrical execution. But here's where things become uniquely bizarre. The punishment for a Vestal virgin who broke her vow was to be buried alive, and not just anywhere. She was buried in a small underground chamber, custom dug in a field known as the Campus Celeratus, or Field of the Wicked, just outside the city gates. But why such a strange method? The answer lies in ritual. Roman law forbade the shedding of a Vestal's blood. She was considered too sacred to be executed directly, so instead they created a legal illusion. She would be placed underground, in a room with a little bed, a candle, a loaf of bread, and some water, so technically she was not killed. She was simply left alone, in darkness, to die slowly. It was mercy, Rome told itself. A legal fiction to soothe uneasy consciences. But make no mistake, it was a slow and cruel death. The ritual of burial let us follow the steps, quietly now, as if watching through the veils of time. When a Vestal was accused and found guilty by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest she was led in a silent procession. She wore her sacred robes, head bowed, her hair undone. Behind her walked priests, and sometimes the very emperor himself. No one spoke. The streets cleared. This was not just an execution. It was mourning for a soul lost to corruption. She was led to the Field of the Wicked. There, the underground chamber had been prepared. She would descend a small ladder into the earth, often without protest, perhaps dazed, perhaps broken. Once she was inside, the entrance was sealed with soil and stone. Rome turned away, and that was the end. The silent questions, how many Vestals met this fate? The answer, strangely, is not many. Historians debate the exact number. Some say perhaps a dozen or so across the many centuries of Rome. Others think even fewer. The process was so ritualized, so public, that false accusations were rare. But they did happen, especially during times of political upheaval. Still, the threat of the punishment loomed large. Imagine growing up knowing your very life depended not just on faithfulness, but on perception. A rumor, a jealous rival, a misstep, it could all lead to the same stone room. In this way, the punishment worked not by frequency, but by fear, the famous case. Cornelia, the last known Vestal, buried alive. Let us pause on one of the last recorded examples of this punishment. In the 4th century CE, the Vestal Cornelia was accused of breaking her vow. By now, Rome was fading, its gods giving way to the rise of Christianity. But the rituals still held sway. Cornelia was tried and sentenced to be buried alive. But before she descended into the dark chamber, she reportedly turned to the gathered crowd and spoke. "I have done nothing. The truth will follow me into the earth." Then she disappeared below, swallowed by history. Her death was one of the final echoes of the old Roman world, a world ruled by ritual, by fear, and by the strange belief that one woman's purity could hold the city together. The men and the double standard, but what of the men involved? If a Vestal was caught, surely the partner was punished too, yes. Sometimes, in most cases, the man was whipped to death or executed in some brutal public fashion. But not always. If he was powerful, if he had allies, he might be spared or simply exiled. Roman justice, for all its pomp, was not immune to bias, but the Vestal, she never escaped. Because she wasn't just breaking a rule, she was violating a myth, and myths are unforgiving. Why this punishment haunts us of all Rome's strange and terrifying punishments, this one stands apart, not for its violence, but for its stillness. A woman buried alive in silence, not screaming, not bleeding, simply fading away, deep beneath the soil, while the city moved on above. But in that small underground room, there was only the sound of your own breathing, and nothing. It reminds us perhaps that cruelty need not be loud. Sometimes the cruelest punishments are the ones that pretend to be kind. The fire still burns, and yet, the sacred fire of Vesta continued to burn tended by the other priestesses, who said nothing, showed nothing, and simply kept their vigil. Even as one sister vanished, the ritual continued. Even as the empire crumbled, the flame remained. It was only with the rise of Christianity and the fall of pagan temples that the order of the Vestals came to an end. In 394 CE, the Emperor Theodosius I disbanded the Vestal College and extinguished the flame. It had burned uninterrupted for over 1,000 years. A whisper from the past, and so, traveler, remember this as you drift toward sleep. In ancient Rome, justice was never simple. It was layered with belief, ritual, fear, and symbolism. The story of the Vestals reminds us that even the most beautiful traditions can cast long shadows. That beneath the marble temples and golden statues there were chambers of silence. Rooms meant not for prayer, but for punishment. The women chosen to keep Rome's spirit alive were also those who could be buried by it. Let your mind rest now. The sacred fire is out. The city is dark. The past whispers softly asking not to be forgotten. The moon still hangs above the rooftops of ancient Rome, casting its quiet silver over temples and tiled homes. The city sleeps, but the memories do not. We continue our walk through the darkened corners of Roman justice where punishment often spoke louder than the crime, and where the most ancient offenses stirred up the most theatrical retribution. Tonight, we turn to one of Rome's most peculiar, unsettling, and deeply symbolic punishments. It is called poena cullei, punishment of the sack. At first glance, it sounds absurd. A man stitched into a leather sack with wild animals and thrown into a river. But as we'll see, every detail had meaning. This was not just punishment, it was ritual, and a terrifying reflection of how the Romans saw family, nature, and the unraveling of order. Let's step closer. The ultimate taboo, parricide. To understand this punishment, we must begin with the crime. Parricide, the murder of one's own parent, was, to the Romans, the most heinous act a person could commit. Worse than theft, worse than treason, even worse than the murder of a stranger. To kill your father or mother was to tear apart the natural order, to spit in the face of the very gods who upheld pietas, or family duty. Family, in Roman eyes, was sacred. The father, the pater familias, held not only authority, but divine weight. He was the center of the household, the protector, the priest. To betray him was to betray Rome itself. Thus, when parricide occurred, it wasn't just crime, it was cosmic disruption. And Rome, ever the lover of balance and meaning, created a punishment to mirror the offense. A sack sewn with symbolism, the poena cullei, was not invented in a day. Like many Roman practices, it evolved slowly over time, shaped by superstition, tradition, and a desire to make justice visible. Let us walk through it together, step by terrible step. The convicted parricide was stripped and beaten with rods. Then his head was covered with a wolf skin, who'd an early sign of disgrace. To wear the skin of a wild beast was to show that you had abandoned humanity. Next, he was sewn inside a large leather sack, but he was not alone. Inside with him were a bizarre collection of animals. A dog, symbol of loyalty, now turned on its master. A monkey, a creature that mimics man, mocking his fall from grace. Snake, chaos, death, and betrayal. And sometimes a rooster, a creature that announces the dawn, trapped in eternal night. These animals were not chosen at random. Each one had symbolic weight in Roman folklore. Their presence meant to reflect the unnaturalness of the crime. A man who killed his parent was, to Rome, no longer fully human, so he would die not as a man but as a beast among beasts. Into the river, drowning with chaos once the sack was sealed tight. Dark and thrashing with panicked animals, it was carried through the city, not in secret. No, traveler. This was a parade of shame. The people would gather, watching in silence or with murmurs of fear, as the sack was brought to the edge of the Tiber River, and there, with little ceremony, it was cast into the waters. Some accounts suggest the sack was weighted with stones or lead to ensure a quick descent. Others say it was allowed to drift an eerie, bobbing mass of leather, fur, and flesh before vanishing beneath the surface. The symbolism was complete. The parricide had been erased from the world, denied burial, denied the fire, denied even air. He had been swallowed by chaos, by animals, by water, by the sack itself. Why so strange? The roots of the ritual now. You might be wondering, why all this? Why not a simple execution? To the Roman mind, the punishment had to fit the disruption. Parricide wasn't just about death, it was about reversing creation. The father gives life, killing him unravels it. The family is sacred, breaking it deserves sacrilege. Society is built on duty. Parricide dissolves that duty into primal chaos. So the poena cullei sought to reflect that reversal, turning the parricide into an animal, stuffing him with fellow beasts, sealing him off from the world, and returning him not to the soil but to the unforgiving waters. Water, to Romans, was not just cleansing. It was also a place of exile, of separation from the living. Casting the sack into the river, Rome was not only killing the criminal, it was unmaking him. Recorded cases. Fact or folklore. Historical accounts of poena cullei are scattered, but a few notable cases survive. One of the earliest known references comes from the 12 Tables, Rome's ancient law code from the 5th century BCE. Later historians like Livy and Suetonius recount its use during the Republic and early Empire. One emperor, Hadrian, even briefly abolished the punishment, perhaps finding it too cruel. But later emperors revived it, and it remained in Roman law for centuries. It's likely that it was rarely carried out, perhaps a few times each generation. But like the punishment of the Vestal Virgins, its power was in the threat, in the image it painted in the public mind. You didn't have to see it often to fear it. The evolving sack, variations through time over the centuries, the ingredients inside the sack sometimes changed. Some records mention a panther instead of a dog. Others omit the monkey or the rooster. In later Christianized versions of Roman law, only the snake remained, symbolizing evil and betrayal. Eventually, as the empire fell and Christianity grew, the poena cullei faded into obscurity. But its legend lingered, revived even in medieval Europe, where similar punishments were described in law codes, though rarely enacted. It became a symbol not just of Roman cruelty, but of how far humanity can go to craft a punishment that feels poetic even if it is monstrous. Punishment as performance once again. Here we see again the Roman genius and horror for symbolic justice. They understood that law is not only about correction, but about communication. The sack didn't just remove the criminal, it told a story of unnatural betrayal. A story of disorder punished by deeper disorder. A story meant to haunt every child who dared raise their hand in anger toward their parents. And though we recoil from it today, the poena cullei was not madness. It was calculated theater. A dark ritual of balance, meant to restore a world that had been knocked off course. The sack in the river, a final reflection. Let us pause now, as if watching from a bridge over the Tiber. The crowd has dispersed, the torchlight has dimmed. All that remains is the water flowing steadily, uncaring, eternal. Somewhere beneath its surface, the sack has vanished. Inside it, a man. And with him, the symbols of his crime, the animals, the darkness, the weight of what he has done. He will never be seen again. No grave will bear his name. No stone will mark the spot. And yet, Rome remembers. For as long as the city endures, stories like this one will flicker in its shadow. And now, traveler, as you lie still, listening to the hush of the past, let this image drift softly across your thoughts, not to disturb your rest, but to remind you of the strange ways justice once walked the earth. The punishment of the sack was not just about death, it was about meaning. A society terrified of disorder created a ritual that mirrored that fear step by step. And in doing so, they left behind one of the most bizarre and unforgettable footnotes in the long scroll of human history. The Tiber flows on, animals are silent. The sack is closed. Sleep well, traveler. The river carries away all things. The city of Rome, proud and ancient, was never built on mercy. Behind every marble column and well-laid road lay another truth. Control was everything. Order was sacred. And for those who defied it, those who rebelled, stole, ran away, or simply stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. The punishment was often as public as it was brutal. Among all the methods of justice Rome devised, one stood above the rest. Not for its cruelty alone, but for its sheer endurance in memory. Crucifixion. We often associate crucifixion with one particular story, one particular hill. But long before that event, and long after, crucifixion was the Roman Empire's favorite tool for humiliation, agony, and spectacle. It was not designed merely to kill. That would have been too easy. Crucifixion was designed to break a man, physically, spiritually, and socially. Let us begin not with the act, but with the principle. To the Romans, crucifixion was not something you did to fellow citizens. It was reserved for the lowest of the low: slaves, pirates, bandits, and rebels. Roman citizens, even when sentenced to death, could claim the right to a more honorable end. Beheading, perhaps, or exile. Crucifixion was beneath them. Literally and symbolically. It was meant for those outside the circle of civilization, for those who had defied the moral and social code so completely that their very death had to be turned into a warning. The process of crucifixion was not standardized. It evolved over time, adjusted according to the mood of the judge, the status of the condemned, and the need for theater. But certain features remained common. A man condemned to crucifixion was first stripped of his dignity, his clothes, his name, and in many cases, his skin. He would be flogged, often severely, with a flagrima whip designed with metal or bone tips to tear flesh with each stroke. This stage was not just punishment, it was prelude. Once weakened and bloodied, he would be forced to carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, through the streets. This march was no quiet affair. Crowds gathered, people jeered, children ran alongside. Roman justice demanded public attention. The condemned was often led past familiar places, past markets and homes, to reinforce a very clear message. This is what happens to those who challenge the state. At the place of execution, the vertical post, or stipes, would already be in place. The patibulum would be affixed to it, forming the cruciform shape. Then came the nailing, not always but often. The hands or wrists and the feet were pierced with thick iron spikes. The Romans were not interested in hitting precise nerves or arteries, aimed only to secure the body to ensure it could not escape even in death. The victim was then hoisted up, exposed to sun, wind, flies, and the gaze of all. And then the waiting began. Crucifixion could last hours, sometimes days. Death did not come swiftly. It arrived through shock, suffocation, organ failure, or sheer exhaustion. The body sagged, the chest collapsed, breathing became shallow, then impossible, and still the crowd watched. This was the point. Crucifixion was never private. It was a stage play in suffering. The Romans placed crosses along roads near city gates, beside busy markets. Travelers would pass the crucified on their way to and from the city, constant reminders of what rebellion looked like. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about deterring the rest. In some cases, crucifixion became mass spectacle. After the failed slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 71 BCE, Thousands of slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, nearly 120 miles of crosses, stretching from Capua to Rome. Imagine that, traveler. Walking a road for days and seeing nothing but dying men nailed to wood. The empire did not whisper, it roared. There were times, of course, when the Romans themselves found the practice distasteful, when the politics shifted, or an emperor wished to appear more merciful. Crucifixion was occasionally banned or restricted, but it always returned, like a shadow stretching across centuries. It was simply too effective, too theatrical, too feared. Some condemned were granted a small mercy. A family member might bribe a guard to pierce the side of the crucified with a spear, ending the agony. Others were left to rot, their bones picked clean by birds, their remains unburied, an added insult in a society that valued funerary rites. The body became unclean, forgotten by all but the law. Even in death, the crucified were denied peace. There is a deeper cruelty here, one that goes beyond the physical. Crucifixion was not merely designed to inflict pain, but to erase dignity. To strip a man not only of his life, but of his place in society. To be crucified was to become a thing, a warning nailed to a tree. And in this, Rome was deliberate. Because if the empire could turn a living person into an object of fear, it could keep the world in order. The pain was part of it. But the shame that lingered longer. Over time, the memory of crucifixion became inseparable from power. It echoed in stories, in scrolls, in quiet conversations over wine. Parents warned children with it. Politicians debated its use. Philosophers questioned its morality. But the practice endured through republic and empire, through Caesar and Augustus and beyond. And yet, as with all things Roman, crucifixion was both terrifying and strangely impersonal. The law did not hate the crucified. It did not even remember them. It simply used them as tools, as signs, as punctuation marks in the long, grim story of Roman justice. Let us imagine now the last breath of such a man. The sun is low. The flies have done their work. The wind picks up dust from the road. He looks out not with anger, but with exhaustion. His body, once strong, is now little more than a scaffold of pain. His eyes flicker, not with defiance, but with distance. He's already halfway gone. The crowd thins. The guards yawn. The city continues. And somewhere, in a shaded courtyard or a cool bathhouse, a magistrate pours a cup of wine and forgets all about the man he sentenced. Such was the rhythm of Rome. Harsh, efficient, detached. And now, traveler, you know what they did? Not just how they killed, but why they killed this way. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't madness. It was order wrapped in pain and fear. So rest now. Let your thoughts drift from the hilltop, from the cross, from the crowd. The light is fading. The past is growing still. In the hushed corners of history, there are punishments that seem born from nightmares so wild and primal that they feel closer to mythology than law. Yet in the Roman world, there was nothing mythical about them. These acts were real, documented, witnessed, even applauded. One such punishment to quell parts theater and terror was known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. To be sentenced ad bestias was not simply to die, was to be reduced to prey. The phrase itself Latin, smooth and cold masked the brutality of what it described. This punishment was most commonly used for enemies of the state, traitors, criminals, and the early followers of outlawed religions. But there were times when being unpopular, inconvenient, or simply unlucky was enough. You see, the Roman Empire was not only a government, it was a spectacle. And nowhere was this more true than in the amphitheater. These arenas, the most famous being the Colosseum in Rome, were more than places of entertainment. They were sanctuaries of violence, monuments to Roman control, and vast echoing stages where power played itself out in flesh and blood. In the center of these arenas stood the condemned, sometimes clothed, sometimes naked, sometimes armed with a stick or shield, often not. Around them, the sand stretched in silence. Above, tens of thousands of eyes stared down from the stone seats. And below the arena floor, waiting behind iron gates, were the beasts. The beasts were not metaphors, were lions, tigers, leopards, and bears. Wolves, hyenas, even elephants or crocodiles. Captured from the distant provinces of Africa or Asia, they were brought to Rome in chains, in cages, exotic symbols of empire. They represented Rome's reach and Rome's wrath. At the appointed moment, a trumpet would sound, a gate would rise, and the beasts, confused and hungry, would step into the blinding light. The crowd would cheer, eager for the dance of death to begin. What happened next depended on the whims of the organizers, the condition of the animals, and the spirit of the crowd. Sometimes the victim was killed, quickly struck down in a blur of claws and teeth. Other times, it was drawn out. A cat and mouse spectacle, a wounded animal, a fleeing man. A game played on the knife's edge of cruelty and excitement. And this was no private justice, no hidden execution. It was a public lesson. The audience, senators, citizens, slaves, were all participants. Their cheers fed the show. Their gasps validated it. In this theater, the line between punishment and entertainment disappeared entirely. The Romans called these events Venatians' beast hunts. But when humans were the hunted, the purpose was not sport. It was punishment. It was ritual. It was control by way of terror. Let us pause for a moment and consider the condemned. He might have been a runaway slave, a rebel soldier, or a dissident philosopher. He might have once walked the streets of Rome in fine sandals, now barefoot in the dust. He stands not just before death, but before 1,000 watching faces, each of them waiting to forget him. The punishment begins long before the beast appears. The air in the arena is hot. The sand reflects the sun. The noise of the crowd is deafening, waves of shouting, laughter, groaning, song. The man is dizzy. His body knows what's coming, even if his mind cannot yet imagine it. And then the gate creaks. The animal steps forward, and Rome watches. Sometimes the condemned was tied to a post or nailed to a platform, unable to move at all. The animal was released to do what nature and training dictated. In these cases, the death was not only certain, but often slow, drawn out for maximum visual effect. At other times, the condemned was made to fight. Wooden weapons were provided, or dull blades, enough to give the illusion of defense, but not enough to offer real hope. These scenarios were the cruelest of all. Hope dangled like bait. And the crowd, knowing the outcome, relished the struggle. There were even elaborate scripts. In one instance, recorded by ancient writers, a man was dressed as the mythical Orpheus and placed in the arena with a trained bear. The crowd laughed as art and punishment blurred together. And then there were the executions disguised as plays. Criminals reenacted scenes from mythology only to die for real when the curtain rose. Prometheus devoured by vultures. Hercules burned alive. These were not actors. They were condemned. The myth was just a costume. The death was real. For the Romans, such punishments served multiple purposes. First, they were efficient. One beast could kill multiple prisoners in a single morning. Second, they were memorable. A man crucified might be forgotten, but a man torn apart by a lion in front of 40,000 people, that was a memory Rome could count on. Third, and perhaps most disturbingly, these punishments affirmed the natural order. Romans saw themselves at the top of the world's pyramid. Everything else, man or beast, was below. The condemned, placed in the dirt with the animals, was being shown his true place. He had stepped outside of society. Now he would be fed to the wilderness. Sometimes, the beasts refused to cooperate. They were tired, sick, frightened. In these cases, the show would falter. The crowd might boo, or laugh, or call for another victim. But even then, the message remained. The empire had dominion over life, death, and everything in between. But what of the animals? Did they understand the role they played? Were they simply weapons flesh turned into law? It is hard to say. Ancient sources sometimes describe trainers teasing the beasts, starving them before the event, or using drugs to incite frenzy. The cruelty was not just human to human. It spread outward, encompassing all. In time, the use of damnatio ad bestias declined. The Christianization of the empire brought new values. Public executions shifted form, compassion crept into the margins. But for centuries, this punishment stood as a pillar of Roman justice, a roaring, bleeding, unforgettable performance. Even today, we remember it. In stories, in films, in half-true legends, we imagine the Colosseum, the lion, the man, and we shiver. But here tonight we do not shiver. We listen. We reflect. We allow the past to move through us slowly like wind through old stone. Because history, even in its darkest corners, has something to teach us about power, about fear, about the strange ways humans try to hold a society together, sometimes with beauty, sometimes with blood. So close your eyes now. Let the sand settle. The gate is closed. The arena is empty. The beast sleeps. The man is gone. It's in Rome, that great terrible city, sighs in the distance. There are few roles in Roman society as sacred, as exalted, and as tightly bound in expectation as that of the Vestal Virgin. These were not just women. They were symbols, living embodiments of Roman purity, of divine favor, of the flame that bound the city to its gods. But in a society obsessed with order, even symbols could fall. And when they did, the punishment was not only bizarre, it was final. Let us step slowly, with reverence, into the house of the Vestals. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. In a Roman world that was often brutal and chaotic, Vesta's flame was constant, a comforting, eternal glow in the temple of Vesta at the heart of the Forum. That flame, it was believed, must never go out. Its extinguishment foretold disaster. Its survival ensured Rome's own. To keep that fire burning, 6 Vestal virgins were chosen. Girls, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, handpicked by the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. Once chosen, they left their families behind. For 30 years, they served. 10 years learning, 10 years performing rites, 10 years teaching. And above all else, they were to remain chaste. Virgins in body and in spirit. That was the vow. That was the law. The Vestals were given great privileges. They lived in a palace near the temple. They held high social status. They were exempt from many traditional female roles in Roman society. They could make wills own property, and even pardon criminals. In a world where most women were defined by their fathers or husbands, Vestals were seen as sacred, separate, powerful. But this power came at a terrible cost. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, she was found to have lain with a man she committed not just a personal sin, but a religious crime, betrayal of Vesta, the threat to Rome's very survival. And there was only one punishment the Romans deemed appropriate for such a crime. She was to be buried alive. Let us pause. It is not often that the phrase buried alive appears in legal documents. It feels more like folklore, like a dark fairy tale whispered by firelight. But for the Romans, it was real, ritualized, documented. A form of punishment designed not merely to kill, but to send a message, one of purity, control, and divine wrath. The trial of a Vestal accused of breaking her vow was a solemn affair. There were no public spectacles, no roaring crowds. The Pontifex Maximus presided. Witnesses were rare. Evidence was often circumstantial. In many cases, the decision rested on signs on men's dreams, the sudden extinguishing of Vesta's sacred flame. If the Vestal was found guilty, her fate was sealed. But Roman law forbade the spilling of a Vestal's blood. She could not be whipped. She could not be hanged or decapitated. So the Romans devised a punishment that killed without visible violence. A small underground chamber would be prepared, usually in the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked just outside the city walls. Inside, a small couch, a lamp, a loaf of bread, a flask of water, and a little milk. These were not meant for survival. They were symbolic. The Romans did not bury their Vestal to starve her. No, they would say she had food, she had water. She was not killed by Rome, but by the gods. On the day of her execution, the condemned Vestal would be dressed in her sacred robes. She would be led through the city in a silent procession. The people, normally quick to cheer or gossip, remained quiet. No one dared interrupt. This was not a criminal being punished. This was a holy vessel being returned to the earth. When they reached the chamber, the priest would lead her down a ladder into the earth. Then, slowly, the entrance was sealed with earth and stones, and Rome turned away. No one spoke of her again. The man involved, if he was known, did not receive such reverence. He was publicly whipped. or executed outright. But rarely did the man carry the weight of the transgression. The Vestal was the flame. If she flickered, it was the whole house that trembled. Why such severity? To understand, we must understand Roman religion not as faith, but as a contract. The gods protected Rome so long as Rome upheld its duties. A violated Vestal was not just a broken vow. It was a breach in the divine contract. Earthquakes, plagues, military defeats, these could all be seen as signs of divine anger. The burial was Rome's way of mending the agreement, of showing the gods, we have done our part. We have punished the impure. Not every accused Vestal was guilty. Some were scapegoats. When disaster struck, the state needed someone to blame. Vestals, despite their sacred status, were not immune. History gives us several names. Postumia, accused for laughing too freely. Tucha, who proved her innocence by carrying water in a sieve. But others like Cornelia, buried in 90 BC, you were not so lucky. And yet, the punishment continued, generation after generation. Because to Rome, symbols mattered. Rituals mattered. A society built on law and tradition must show the world in itself that those foundations were unshakable. But imagine the stillness of that chamber, the flickering lamp, the slow decay of breath, silence, thick and heavy like the soil above. Condemned Vestal does not cry out. She cannot. She is still sacred. Even in death, she belongs to the goddess. Her punishment is not shouted, not gory, but quiet and final. She does not become a martyr, nor a villain. She simply disappears. The world above continues. Fires burn. Senators speak. The city lives on. But somewhere beneath the earth, a forgotten room holds the memory of a woman whose only crime may have been love, or misfortune, or the bad luck of omens. It is perhaps one of the most haunting aspects of Roman justice. Its ability to turn sacred duty into a weapon, to make silence into punishment, to bury not only a body, but a symbol. Today we remember the Vestals with a strange reverence. Their statues still stand. Temple ruins remain in the forum. Tourists walk past, unaware of the stories buried deeper than the stone. But here in this quiet moment of reflection, we remember them fully, not just as priestesses, but as people, as daughters taken from homes, as women bound by law, as lives extinguished not in violence, but in ritual stillness. The eternal flame of Vesta may have long gone out, but its light flickers in these stories, in these long-forgotten echoes of Rome's strange, beautiful, and often brutal past. There are punishments in history that seem invented by the darkest corners of myth, too theatrical, too detailed, too cruel to be real. Yet in ancient Rome, one such punishment was not only real, it was reserved for one of the most serious crimes a Roman could commit: the murder of a parent. This was called the poena cullei, penalty of the sack. And it is as bizarre as it is unforgettable. Let us return quietly to the streets of Rome, where family was sacred and the idea of patricide. The killing of one's father or mother was seen not simply as a personal crime, but as an attack on the very fabric of Roman society. In Roman thought, the father, the paterfamilias, was the linchpin of the household, the vessel of ancestral memory, the one who carried the family's name, gods, and reputation. To kill such a figure was to not only destroy a man, but to undo centuries of tradition. It wasn't murder, it was desecration. A crime against blood, against history, against Rome itself. And so the punishment was equally symbolic. The poena cullei evolved over time, but its most well-known version appeared during the imperial era. Ritual, cruelty, and drama often met in the punishment of criminals. If a Roman was found guilty of patricide, he would not be beheaded, nor crucified, nor simply imprisoned. Instead, he was to be sewn into a large leather sack, the cullei salong, with a carefully chosen group of animals. Then, the sack would be thrown into a river, and the man would drown not alone, but in the company of terror. But what animals, and why? According to the most common sources, 4 companions joined the condemned in the sack: a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Each was chosen deliberately. Each, in its own way, was a symbol of chaos, of betrayal, of unnatural behavior. The dog, usually seen as loyal, here was made a sign of broken faith. The rooster, loud and watchful, became the reminder of time and guilt. The snake-lung, a symbol of treachery and hidden threat. And the monkey, perhaps the most unsettling. A creature so close to human, yet not. A parody of man. A distorted mirror. Its presence in the sack made the scene not only terrifying, but grotesque. All 5 were sewn into the sack, their fates sealed together. Then, the sack was thrown sometimes into the Tiber, sometimes into the sea. No one in that bag would survive, that was certain. What happened inside, what sounds were made, what panic unfolded, no one ever knew. And perhaps that was the point. The Romans could have executed the guilty in simpler ways. But they chose this because punishment for them was not just about death, it was about meaning. The sack was more than a prison, it was a world turned upside down. A denial of nature, tomb of madness. There was something else, to something deeply Roman. They believed that murder polluted not only the hands of the killer, but the very ground upon which he died. The body of a parricide, they thought, was unfit for burial in Roman soil. Even unfit to be exposed on land. The river, flowing and eternal, would take him away, carry the sin with it. The sack kept the body from touching the earth. This punishment wasn't used often. Parricide was rare, and convictions rarer still. But the very existence of the poena cullei was enough to inspire dread. It hung in the cultural imagination, fate worse than execution. A punishment designed not to correct, but to erase. To remove someone so completely from the order of things that even their death was unnatural. In some versions of the punishment, especially in earlier Republican times, the animal companions varied. Some sources mention only snakes. Others include a monkey and a dog, but no rooster. In the chaotic days of late antiquity, the animals were sometimes omitted entirely. But the heart of the punishment, the sack, the water, the drowning, remained constant. There's something eerie about the image, isn't there? We can imagine it slowly. The sack, leathery and writhing, hoisted by silent executioners. The muffled sounds from within man and beast in fear, tangled in darkness, crowd watching, but not speaking. And then the splash, the water rising up, the sack drifting down, swallowed by the current. No screams, just the river, moving on, as it always does. How do we make sense of this? The Romans lived in a world where law and religion were not separate, where justice had to be seen and felt, where symbolism mattered as much as outcome. The poena cullei was not meant to reform. It was not for the benefit of the condemned. It was a signal to the living. This is what happens when you betray your blood. It is worth noting, too, that such elaborate punishments were often reserved for the lower classes. A wealthy noble might receive exile instead, or a quiet execution behind villa walls, but for the ordinary citizen, the sack awaited. In that way, it was not only a punishment, it was theater, performance of morality. A moment where the state reminded the public, we are watching, we are in control. And yet, the most chilling aspect may be how calm the records are. Roman historians describe the poena cullei not with outrage, but with formality. It was to them simply the correct response to a grave crime, right? As orderly as a funeral, as justified as a law. Today, it reads like nightmare. A story from some dark fable told to frighten children. But it happened, more than once. And it left behind not just fear, but questions about justice, cruelty, and how far a society will go to protect its ideals. The Tiber no longer carries leather sacks. The law codes of Rome have long since faded. But the memory remains quiet, strange, unforgettable. Let us leave this segment slowly, as the river leaves behind only ripples. No bodies, no names. Just a story drifting further downstream. Among all the strange and brutal practices of ancient Rome, few were more feared by soldiers than decimatio, punishment so severe, so deliberately cruel, that its very name still echoes through history. Derived from the Latin word decem, meaning 10, decimation was not reserved for criminals, nor was it inflicted on slaves or enemies. Noet was used against Rome's own soldiers. Imagine that. Punishment not from without, but from within. Delivered by comrades, ordered by commanders. A sentence of death, not for the guilty alone, but for every 10th man. To understand decimation, we must step into the ranks of the Roman legions, where discipline was ironclad and duty sacred. Rome's military machine was famous for its precision, for its ruthless efficiency. The soldiers, often marching hundreds of miles on rough terrain, were expected to obey without question, fight without hesitation, and die without complaint. But even Rome's soldiers, hard, trained, loyal, could falter. They could panic. They could desert. And in moments of shame moments, when an entire unit failed in courage or discipline, Rome had a tool to make an example. That tool was decimation. Let us picture it. A legion, perhaps 5,000 strong, has disobeyed orders in battle, or worse, fled the battlefield. The disgrace is total, not just for one soldier, but for all. Their commander is furious. The offense in his eyes cannot go unpunished. And so he invokes decimatio. The soldiers are gathered, silent, the order is read. Every cohort, every century, stands frozen. Then, one by one, they are divided into groups of 10. Within each group, lots are drawn. 10 men brothers in arms who trained together, fought together, bled together, must now watch as one is chosen for death. There is no appeal, no trial. It is chance, a grim lottery. The chosen soldier is beaten to death by the remaining 9 and 9, often using clubs, stones, or their own bare hands. The killing is not quick. It is deliberate, ritualistic. Sometimes the commanders force the survivors to sleep outside the camp walls for days, without food or shelter. They were to feel shame, to learn fear, and to never, ever repeat the offense. There's something deeply unsettling about this punishment, not simply because of the violence, but because of the betrayal it demanded. Soldiers turning on their own, trust unraveling in a moment. The very cohesion that made the Roman army so strong being used, paradoxically, to enforce obedience through trauma. Why did Rome do this? The answer lies, as always, in Rome's obsession with order. Decimation was not about punishing the guilty, it was about restoring fear. The Roman army believed that discipline mattered more than justice. If a soldier feared his commander more than the enemy, he would never flee. If he feared his own brothers in arms, he would stand and fight. Decimation created that fear, and it worked. It was rare, yes, too brutal to be used often, but it was real. Soldiers knew it. The threat of decimation hung over every failure, every retreat. In some cases, just the announcement of decimation was enough to bring a mutinous force back into line. One of the most famous accounts of decimation comes from the 3rd century BCE, during the early years of the Roman Republic. A commander named Appius Claudius ordered decimation after a unit retreated in the face of the enemy. He spared no one. The lot was drawn. Men wept. Some tried to flee, but the sentence was carried out. Centuries later, even the powerful general Crassus, the same Crassus, who crushed Spartacus, used decimation to discipline his own men. After suffering defeat by the Parthians, he needed to show strength. Decimation was his answer. The punishment, though terrible, sent a message. Loyalty was non-negotiable. And yet, the horror of it lingered. Even Roman writers, who often glorified military discipline, spoke of decimation with a kind of awe. It was not just punishment, it was psychological warfare inflicted upon Rome's own. The practice, over time, faded. It was too costly, too unpopular. Later emperors preferred executions, or forced labor, or exile. But the idea of decimation remained in language, in legend and law. To this day, when we say something is decimated, we often mean destroyed entirely. But in Rome, it meant the destruction of 1/10, with 100% of the fear. We can pause here and think slowly about the effect this had on the men who survived. You were not punished, but you killed your friend. You didn't draw the short straw, but you helped someone else die. And after that, you had to keep marching. Keep fighting. Keep trusting. It is hard to imagine the silence in the camp that night, the way eyes would avoid each other, the way laughter would not return. Rome had punished failure, but at what cost? Still too Roman eyes. This was the price of empire, the price of order. They did not want brave soldiers. They wanted obedient ones. And they achieved that again and again through fear. Even today, military historians look back at decimation as a strange tool, punishment that punished loyalty alongside cowardice. a reminder that in the Roman world, guilt could be collective and death arbitrary. Let us not rush past this image. Let us sit with it quietly. 10 soldiers, 9 fists. One man chosen not for what he did, but for what all failed to do. And the march continues. In a world where law met religion at every turn, the ancient Romans sometimes turned to something far older than written statutes or judges' verdicts. They looked to the gods themselves, when human judgment seemed insufficient or when suspicion was too. Clouded by politics, the Romans relied on sacred rituals to decide guilt or innocence. These were known as trials by ordeal. The idea behind ordeal was simple, yet profound. The gods would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The outcome of the ordeal was not just a matter of human judgment, but divine will. If a person survived the trial unscathed, they were deemed pure. If they suffered, they were condemned. One of the most chilling versions was the trial by fire. Imagine, for a moment, a Roman citizen accused of a serious crime, perhaps theft, sacrilege, or even murder. The evidence is weak or conflicting. The jury is divided. The magistrate turns to an ancient custom. The accused must pass through fire war hold, a red-hot iron, and the gods will decide. The ritual was simple to describe, but terrifying in execution. The accused would either walk barefoot over burning coals, or carry a glowing iron bar a certain distance. Their hands or feet would be bandaged and examined after a set number of days. If the wounds were healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If they festered or worsened, the verdict was guilt. There was no room for lawyers here, no appeals, no debate. Only faith and flesh. This trial by fire was not common, but it was deeply ingrained in Roman culture. It spoke to a time when the boundary between law and religion was blurred. When the state and the gods shared the responsibility of justice, the trial served many purposes. It forced the accused to confront their fate physically, not just verbally. It acted as a terrifying deterrent, and it reassured the community that the verdict was beyond human bias. Roman writers describe cases where people survived the ordeal against all odds, emerging with little more than scorched skin seen as proof of divine favor. Others were burned, their cries silenced by the weight of belief. The trial by fire also reflects a broader Roman belief in the power of ritual purity and pollution. The fire was a purifier. If a person was guilty, they could not pass through it unharmed. If innocent, the flames would part as if guided by the gods. There were variations, of course. In some cases, the accused might drink a potion of water mixed with ashes, or face other physically taxing tests. But the principle remained. The gods would speak through the body's reaction. Such punishments remind us how ancient Rome was a world governed not just by laws, but by the invisible hand of faith. Justice was not always a matter of evidence or reason. It was often a matter of belief. Imagine now the tension as a person approaches the fire. The crowd is silent, watching, waiting. The heat rises. The flames flicker and dance. The accused takes a step forward, then another. Their feet burn, their skin tightens. The moment stretches. Afterwards, the bandages are removed. The wounds examined. A hush falls. Then the announcement: innocent or guilty. The consequences were life or death. A clean burn might bring relief and freedom. A festering wound might mean execution, exile, or slavery. A trial by fire, in its slow, agonizing way, sealed fates. It left no doubt in the minds of the people. The gods had spoken. Tonight, as we lie down to rest, we carry with us the image of that fire, a reminder that justice, in ancient times, was a flame that could either warm or consume. In a world as ruled by law and order as ancient Rome, was another realm beneath the surface, a hidden world of magic, superstition, and whispered curses. Justice was not always served by magistrates and courts. Sometimes it was left to unseen forces, invoked through words carved in lead or inscribed on thin sheets of metal. These were the curse tablets, or defixiones, a form of punishment that was invisible, yet potent. The curse tablet was a tool of desperation, a way for the powerless or the wronged to call on the gods and the spirits of the dead, to intervene where human justice failed. There were small objects, often folded or pierced with nails, and buried in secret places: graves, wells, crossroads, or temples. The idea was simple. The curse, sealed in the tablet, would bind or harm the target until the gods delivered justice. These tablets reveal a Roman world deeply concerned with fairness, retribution, and control, but also one that recognized the limits of earthly power. If a thief stole your goods, or a rival bested you in a court case, or a lover betrayed you, you might turn to magic when no one else would listen. What kinds of curses were carved into these tablets? Often they were prayers for misfortune, that the target's tongue be twisted, their legs falter, their health fail, or their reputation crumble. Some called for violence or even death, while others wished only for embarrassment or bad luck. The language was often formal, invoking gods like Mercury, Pluto, or Hecatodes, associated with boundaries, the underworld, and magic. One of the most fascinating aspects of cursed tablets is how personal they were. Unlike formal punishments decreed by the state, these curses were intimate, direct attacks on individuals. They show us the fears and desires of everyday Romans, the merchants, slaves, lovers, and rivals who sought justice in their own way. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of these tablets across the Roman world, from Britain to North Africa to the city of Rome itself. Some are crude and hastily carved. Others are carefully written with poetic curses. Each is a snapshot of personal grievance frozen in time. The secrecy of their burial was crucial. By hiding the curse in places connected to the dead or the divine, the petitioner hoped to guarantee its power. It was an unseen sentence, a punishment carried out not by human hands but by forces beyond. Imagine now the quiet moments before a cursed tablet was buried. A person, perhaps trembling, angry, or desperate, carved their plea into the lead. They folded the tablet tightly, pierced it with a nail, then walked to a graveyard or well under cover of darkness. They buried the tablet, whispering prayers or curses. Then they left, hoping the gods would answer. What does this tell us about Roman society? That beneath the order, the law, and the grandeur, there was a world of fear and uncertainty. That justice was not always accessible. That sometimes people felt powerless against the rich, the connected, or the unjust. The cursed tablet was a last resort, a way to take back control in a world that often seemed indifferent. These tablets also remind us that the Romans believed in the power of words spoken, written, and hidden. Language itself was a form of magic, a tool to shape reality. In a sense, the cursed tablets were punishments without victim's hand. You count the invisible gods and spirits who were called to act. They were warnings whispered in the dark, a reminder that justice could be slow, unseen, but always watching. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine those quiet burials, the folded tablets, and the hopes and fears that made them necessary. Imagine the unseen hands shaping fates in silence. In the long history of punishment, few forms have been as raw, as visible, and as universally feared as the scourging. Known in Latin as flagellatio, scourging was a punishment that left more than physical marks. It left a stain on the soul, a public display of humiliation, a stark reminder of power wielded without mercy. In ancient Rome, scourging was commonly used to enforce order, to punish slaves and criminals, and to discipline soldiers. Yet beneath its surface brutality, scourging reveals a great deal about Roman society, its values, and its unyielding drive for control. Imagine, then, the scene. The condemned whether slave, soldier, or criminal is brought before a magistrate, or a centurion, or even a crowd. Their hands may be bound, their back bare. The executioner steps forward, holding a whip, often made of leather thongs, knotted with bits of metal or bone designed to tear flesh. The crowd watches. Some are curious, some indifferent, others openly hostile. The first lash falls, sharp and loud against skin. Then another, and another. The pain is immediate and intense, but scourging was not merely about pain, it was about shame. In Rome, honor was everything. Public reputation was a currency more valuable than gold. To be scourged was to be marked not only physically, but socially. The wounds were badges of disgrace, visible evidence of having crossed the line. For slaves, scourging was almost a daily threat. It was used not only as punishment, but as control. A whip could keep a slave obedient, productive, fearful. Many slaves carried scars from scourging that never fully healed. It was a reminder that they were property, not persons. But scourging was not limited to slaves, as free citizens could also be scourged though, usually under strict legal conditions. Soldiers who disobeyed orders or fled from battle faced scourging as discipline. Even Roman citizens guilty of certain crimes might be whipped, though often less severely. The severity of scourging varied. Some received only a few lashes, others were beaten until unconscious. In extreme cases, scourging was a prelude to execution, inflicting maximum suffering before death. One of the more chilling aspects of scourging is how it was often a public affair. The punishment was carried out openly in forums, marketplaces, or outside city gates. This public visibility served a dual purpose: to deter others and to reinforce social hierarchies. The message was clear. The state held power over bodies, and those who broke its laws would be exposed and humiliated. The executioners themselves were often slaves or low-status individuals, tools of the system. Their task was brutal but necessary. They inflicted pain but also maintained order. It's important to consider the psychological impact on those who were scourged. The whip not only tore flesh but shattered spirit. The knowledge that one's pain was witnessed, that shame was shared with a crowd, added a layer of suffering beyond the physical. Roman writers sometimes describe scourging with grim detail. Tacitus, for example, recounts instances where political prisoners were scourged in the presence of senators and crowds, a humiliation designed to break their will and dignity. Even the famous Spartacus, before leading a great slave revolt, reportedly witnessed or suffered scourging, a spark that fueled his desire for freedom. Scourging also played a role in the later Roman world's judicial system. It was a common punishment for those accused of minor crimes or moral offenses. Yet the lash was often used without fairness, disproportionately targeting the weak slaves, foreigners, and the poor. This brutal instrument of control highlights a fundamental tension in Roman society: the coexistence of law and cruelty, of civilization and violence. Rome was a city of grandeur and order, but it was built upon the backs of those who bore the whip. One might wonder if there was any mercy in this practice. Occasionally, yes, as magistrates limited scourging or forbade excessive lashes. But overall, the whip was a tool of dominance, not justice. And the scars, they remained long after the lash, both on bodies and in memory. For some, the marks were lifelong reminders of pain endured and power lost. Yet, despite its brutality, scourging was also a symbol of order. In a society obsessed with discipline, it was a method to maintain cohesion. Without fear of punishment, Rome feared its armies would falter, its slaves would rebel, and its citizens would defy. We can reflect on this now as we think of the many faces nameless and forgotten that bore the lash. Their pain, though silent in history, shaped the course of an empire. As night deepens, imagine the quiet aftermath. The punished man or woman, nursing wounds hidden beneath torn clothing, moving through a city unaware or uncaring. The whip may be gone, but its shadow lingers. Among the many punishments that ancient Rome devised to maintain order and loyalty, one stands out for its stark symbolism and terrifying finality: the Tarpeian Rock. This punishment was reserved for traitors and those who betrayed the city of fate, both brutal and public, a literal leap to death that marked the ultimate rejection by Roman society. To understand the significance of the Tarpeian Rock, we must first place ourselves in the heart of Rome itself, high upon the Capitoline Hill. The Capitoline was more than just a hill. It was the spiritual and political center of Rome, home to temples, government buildings, and symbols of Roman power. At its southern summit lay a sheer cliff, later known as the Tarpeian Rock, a place from which the condemned were hurled to their deaths. The origin of the name Tarpeian is linked to a story as old as Rome's early days. Tarpeia was said to be a Roman maiden who betrayed the city to the Sabines in exchange for what she thought was their gold bracelets, but instead, they crushed her with their shields. Her name became forever associated with treachery, and the cliff was named in her memory, a grim reminder of betrayal's cost. Throwing traitors from the Tarpeian Rock was not simply execution, it was a ritual expulsion. It symbolized a complete severing of ties, a casting out from the city and its protection. The body was left below as a warning to others. To be thrown from the rock was to be utterly rejected by Rome. The process was chilling in its formality. Condemned would be led to the edge of the cliff, sometimes paraded through the city as a final humiliation. There was no mercy, no hope. The fall was swift, the impact fatal. This punishment was used especially against those convicted of per duellio high treasons, such as attempting to overthrow the government or conspiring with Rome's enemies. It was a sentence that matched the crime, betrayal so deep that death alone was not enough. The act of falling, of leaving the city by force, was part of the punishment. The Tarpeian Rock also served a political function. Public executions like this were spectacles, intended to reinforce loyalty and deter dissent. The image of a traitorous body lying broken below the cliff was a powerful message to the citizens of Rome. Betrayal is not tolerated. It will be punished without hesitation or mercy. Over time, this punishment became less common, especially as other forms of execution gained favor. But for centuries, the Tarpeian Rock remained a potent symbol of place where the fate of the city's worst enemies was sealed. There are recorded instances of notable figures meeting their end there. For example, during the early Republic, some senators or generals who fell out of favor or were found guilty of treason faced this grim death. It was the state's ultimate rejection. The punishment also carried a religious dimension. Romans believed that those who died outside the city's sacred boundaries were denied proper burial rites, condemning their souls to unrest. Being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock was not just death, it was a spiritual condemnation. We can imagine the scene, the condemned walking slowly toward the cliff's edge. The crowd gathered in silence or murmuring with unease. The wind whipping around the hilltop, the sun casting long shadows. Then the final step, and the fall. The sound of bodies striking rock below, and then silence. This stark act contrasts sharply with some other Roman punishments that involved elaborate ritual or drawn-out suffering. The Tarpeian Rock was swift and decisive, a final break with the city and its people. It is worth reflecting on what this punishment meant to the Romans themselves. It was a reminder that loyalty was sacred, that the city was a living organism demanding fidelity. Betrayal was not only a crime against the state, but a wound to the soul of Rome, even today. The cliff remains a silent witness to this history, its stones absorbing centuries of memory and meaning. As we rest now, let the image of the Tarpeian Rock fade softly into the night, a reminder of the fine line between loyalty and treason, and the ancient city's relentless pursuit of order. As our slow and careful journey through the strange and often grim punishments of ancient Rome comes to an end, it's time to pause and reflect. What have these tales of fire, sack, whip, rock, and ritual taught us? Beyond the horror and spectacle lies a deeper story, one about a civilization striving to hold itself together, to build order from chaos, and to protect a society that valued tradition above all. Ancient Rome was a world both familiar and foreign. It's the same city that gave us laws, roads, and republican ideals, also meted out justice with severity that shocks our modern sensibilities. Its punishments were harsh, symbolic, and often public, a way to remind citizens of the power of the state, the sanctity of loyalty, and the consequences of betrayal. Yet, beneath the surface brutality, there was a profound respect for order and a belief that law and ritual must work hand in hand. The Vestal Virgin's sacred silence, the army's grim decimation, the gods' fiery judgment teach was part of a system designed to protect Rome's soul. From these punishments, we learn that justice is never simple. It reflects the values, fears, and hopes of its people. What was once deemed necessary for survival may today seem cruel or strange. But history asks us to understand, not only to judge. In our own time, as civil engineers, planners, and builders, we stand on the shoulders of these ancient legacies. We carry forward a respect for rules, for discipline, and for the communities that depend on our work. We also carry the responsibility to progress, to build a society where justice is tempered by compassion, where order is balanced by humanity. The echoes of Rome's punishments remind us. Societies are fragile. They require laws, yes, but they also require empathy. They demand strength, but also mercy. And above all, they need voices that remember the past while boldly shaping the future. So as you close your eyes tonight, dear traveler, carry these stories not as burdens, but as lessons. The past is never truly gone. It lives in the stones beneath our feet, in the laws we write, and in the lives we lead. May these reflections inspire you to honor tradition while embracing progress, to value order while nurturing kindness, and to build not only structures of stone and steel, but communities of trust and hope. Thank you for walking this path through history with me. May your rest be deep and your dreams peaceful. I hope to see you again soon for another journey into the quiet, forgotten moments of our shared past. Good night, traveler.